So again, I would just like to thank everyone for being here today. I'm Susan Kempinen, and we are all here because we want to hear from Jennifer Lohman of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. And I also would like to thank our co-sponsors here today, the other organizations who are putting today's program on with the Merowitz Center, is the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, it's a tongue twister, the National Council of Jewish Women St. Louis, and Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. So I am going to turn things over to Jen Bernstein, and she's from the National Council of Jewish Women. She is going to do the introduction today for our esteemed speaker. Oh, Jennifer, you're muted.
Thank you, Susan. We are very lucky to be hearing from Jennifer today. She's amazing. Jennifer Lohman is the co-founder of 3 local organizations, the St. Louis Area Voter Protection Coalition, and Every Generation, Inc., and Indivisible St. Louis. Jennifer is a regional coordinator for the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition's Election Protection Field Program and chair of MOVPC's Anti-Disinformation Committee, as well as a member of the National Election Protection Anti-Disinformation Working Group, the Transformative Justice Coalition's Voting Rights Alliance, and the League of Women Voters. Jennifer graduated from Notre Dame Law School and worked as a litigator and federal judicial clerk before turning to nonprofit and political activities. She lives here in St. Louis with her husband, Don, and has 3 nearly grown children. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And before I put on my presentation, I do want to apologize if you hear a dog in the background barking or whining. It's not my dog. I was driving here to give my presentation and came across a dog in the middle of the road, had it jump into my car. Now I've got it and I don't know what to do with it. So he or she is wanting my attention, but I am going to endeavor to concentrate solely on this presentation. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully share the right one. Okay. So I am going to give you a presentation today that is about the developments in Missouri voting law, but that's grounded in information about the whole disinfo, misinfo, manipulation landscape generally, because it's all really important and it's all very much interconnected. So as a quick overview, for those of you who may not have heard my presentation before, this is kind of like a really ugly Venn diagram where you have 3 categories of concern. You know, they're often conflated, but they're very different, even though they do sometimes occupy the same space. One is misinformation, which is an honest error. Somebody really intends to be helpful, but gives bad information. That is super, super common with voting because every state does voting differently. There have been numerous changes in Missouri over the past few years, sometimes changing one way and then changing back and then changing again. So it can be hard to follow. And that's why, you know, when you're talking about voting, misinformation is very, very common, although again, it's very well intentioned. Disinformation is a lot more insidious because those are lies that are intended to cause harm, and that harm might not even be to make people believe the disinformation. It might only be to confuse people or to make people angry or to further drive a wedge between folks in our country. So disinformation is a huge, huge problem, and only getting worse with technology and the ability to do things like, you know, make a I guess a deep fake and create an entire person out of whole cloth who looks real. So there's all kinds of things going on with disinformation that we could spend a couple days on it alone. Manipulation, which is sometimes called malinformation, but that's not a very easy word to say. So I'm sticking with manipulation because that really hits right at the core of what it is. Manipulation can be based on accurate facts, can be based on truth, based on real controversies, but it is something that folks can experience online, in that those real controversies, real facts, real situations are used to generate more controversy, to convince people of something, to push people to the boundaries of their ideological belief system, to make folks believe that everybody cares about an issue that maybe not everybody actually cares about. So it's a really effective way for bad actors to create chaos and division and confusion, and sometimes, discourage people from voting, which is the very important thing that we're talking about here. So what all these things do separately and together, they stoke hatred and prejudice, they spread misleading information about the issues, which makes it hard for people to, vote on something when they're constantly hearing conflicting or perhaps even completely false information. It can result in people getting bad information about where and how to vote, whether that information is given with, malicious intent or not. This can convince people not to vote. It can harm public health and safety, which I think we all saw during the COVID pandemic. It fosters conspiracies. And it also, which I think is, the two things that are the most important today, is that it can cause fomenting of an insurrection, and it can provide a pretext for suppressive laws. So these are, the really key part of this is that the laws we're going to talk about today, and the laws that are being enacted all over the country, are not based in fact for the most part. They're based in disinformation about what really happens in elections. But this has a really long history in voter suppression. So, I'm just going to be really real here for a minute. This country was not really established as a representative democracy. This was not that different from England, except our landed aristocracy didn't have titles and George Washington refused the crown. But that's not to say that people didn't kind of want that same situation. In those days, the only people who could vote were white, male, landed Protestants, but only a certain kind of Protestant, because you had to be a Protestant who wasn't a Quaker, who were debt-free. So that's a really tiny segment of the population, essentially like the aristocracy back in England. So that was part of, that's the foundation of American history. And like our entire history since then has been an effort for people who are not in that category to manage to gain some kind of power, to have a voice, to have the power of self-determination through voting. So, this is where we are. And but that struggle, that original struggle, still exists, because there are those who really are trying to pull it back from where we got to. In 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, that was probably one of the most key steps in making this a truly representative democracy. But we know that is not completely in effect anymore because of Supreme Court decisions. And certainly there are a lot of efforts to sort of pull back, as far as possibly can be, to the original vision of this country being ruled by a minority of, a wealthy ruling class. So that's what this is all about. So it's from the founding fathers to Jim Crow laws, which were, grounded in the same thing, to take away Black political power that had been gained after the Civil War. It's like there's a direct line between that and the kind of disinformation, manipulation, and resulting, suppressive voting laws that we have now. It's just, what's the pretext for it? Today, this is the pretext for it. And it usually goes under the guise of like preventing fraud or, maintaining election integrity, when these things are just, it's just a pack of lies. Nothing that they're doing now is necessitated by fact. They are looking for a problem so that their solution can be put into place, and they're convincing people that there is a problem, but there isn't a problem. They tried really hard to prove that when the previous president had his voter commission. they really went out and combed through records trying to find evidence of, what I really should just call the F word, because voter fraud, shouldn't even mention it. You can't even put that idea in people's heads. It's really just not a thing to the extent that they want folks to think it is. So they tried really hard to establish it, couldn't do it. You can even, if you dig around far enough, find the report that they came up with state by state, and you'll see that, they didn't really find anything. And what they did find are things that are not solved by the suppressive laws they're putting into place. So it is, quite the racket. Well, so all that gets us, among the many laws that were enacted across the United States, that gets us to HB 1878 in Missouri. Now, strict photo ID in Missouri is like The Walking Dead. It will not go away. I mean, you can kill it and it pops right back up. It has been, they've enacted it. It's been struck down. They tried it again. It's been struck down. They've tried it again. It's been struck down. Well, I guess it hasn't been struck down yet, but it should be, because legally it's, it's the same thing that has been struck down many times before. However, we're getting close to the election, and that creates a lot of problems. Even if this law is struck down, people are still going to probably have false impressions about it. They may still think that a photo ID is required. I mean, who knows? So it's really important to look at both and there are some good things in 1878, but it's really important to realize that this was enacted during a time period where, you're butting right up against an election. So everything in this law creates confusion that is, preventing us from doing the work in registering voters and educating voters. And it could also have a suppressive effect simply if people don't know what the status of the law is by election day. But there are a few good things. The one thing that I think is really helpful is that Missouri voters no longer need to re-register before the voter registration deadline when they move to a new jurisdiction within Missouri. It used to be that if you moved from the city to the county, you were no longer a registered voter in Missouri, and you had to register before the deadline in order to be eligible to vote. A lot of people got caught by that because it didn't really make a lot of, logical sense, because you figure, I'm a Missouri voter, I should be able to vote, but that's not how it worked. Now it finally is. So if you make that move, your voter registration can be updated right up to and including election day by doing an address change at the polling place that serves your new address. So that's actually a really good thing. The reasons for voting absentee have been expanded to include healthcare workers, first responders, and law enforcement. That's included under the excuse for absentee voting that involves poll workers. And all of those folks, while they're eligible to vote absentee, if they choose to do so by mail, they do have to have the signature on their ballot notarized. Finally, there might be 2 weeks of no excuse in-person absentee voting before election day this fall, but the Missouri legislature put what I would consider probably like a poison pill into HB 1878, saying that if the strict photo ID is struck down, then this 2 weeks of no excuse in-person absentee voting goes away too. So that's, kind of, I was on the fence about putting that in the good for voters. If there's some way that it survives, even if the strict photo ID doesn't, then it really would be just like a good thing. So what's really bad for voters though here is that now there's the restrictive photo ID requirement that really can really adversely affect hundreds of thousands of people in Missouri. That's because you have to have a non-expired state or federal photo ID in order to vote a regular ballot. That means a driver's license, an official state ID, a passport, something like that. What it doesn't include are things like your photo ID as a student. If you're a college student and you have a photo ID from a state university, too bad. That's not one of the IDs they accept. And I did see some information from the city election board stating that if college students in Missouri who are in Missouri and want to vote in Missouri go to get a Missouri ID, even if they just get the non-driver's state ID, that state ID will void the driver's license that they currently have from their home state. So that's a huge problem that I'm sure a lot of people, haven't really thought about. There is a way for people who don't have an 1878 compliant ID to vote, and that's going to the polls and voting on a provisional ballot. And that provisional ballot is put into an envelope that will go back to the election board, and a bipartisan team of election officials will determine if the signature on the ballot envelope matches the signature or signatures in the voter's file. And the collection of signatures they keep there include like the signature on the voter registration card, the signature on any absentee ballot applications that had been submitted. So there's just like a series of ways that they can do this signature match. The problem is, every election board could do this differently. Everybody is going to have a different subjective opinion about signature matching. And signature matching can be really difficult, for people whose signature changed due to age, illness, injury, or if you're one of the people who registered to vote online and, signed the voter registration on a touch screen, and maybe gave it the grocery store touchpad treatment and just kind of scrawled your signature on there. Well, that's going to be a difficult signature match. So those are all issues that make the provisional ballot option, while it's good that it exists, is certainly not good enough to overcome the bad part of the restrictive photo ID. And, the other really bad part of the restrictive photo ID is that by the time this, came about and the law took effect, it was pretty much already too late for some folks to get the documents they need to get an ID if they didn't have one. Because if you have to go out of state to get a birth certificate or marriage certificate, get those documents ordered and get them returned to you, that can take weeks and sometimes even months. So those folks were up against a deadline that really is out of their control. And even if they were, completely on top of it, might not have been able to get there. And then, of course, there's the issue of folks who have an ID, but maybe no longer drive because of age. Well, I mean, if you don't drive, why would you go spend hours in a DMV getting a new ID, even when you have an expired photo ID? It's got your name, it's got your picture, it's got your address, but just because you don't drive and it's expired, you can't use it. That is a situation that older folks can run into. And of course, there's always, sometimes you blow past that ID deadline to renew your driver's license. You can forget because they're good for a really long time. And if you don't look at it regularly, you could make that mistake. And how terrible would that be to think that you have the ID, walk up there, and it turns out that your driver's license expired, 3 weeks prior. The other thing about 1878 is that it's really bad for activists. And I feel like it has really had a huge adverse impact on the work that activists have done this fall and that they felt comfortable doing because of the legal risks involved. So 1878 bans voter registration by anyone other than a government employee who gets paid for their work. So people cannot get paid to register voters. Government employees can, but people in other in the private sector can't get paid to register voters. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean you can't get paid, per registration if you're working for a company that's just there to register voters? Or does it mean that if you have a paid position, say at a food bank, and in the course of your work at the food bank, you register voters, well, you're getting paid and you're registering voters. Is that against the law? Could be. I mean, from the face of it, that seems like it would be. And that is, extremely restrictive. And that's why that part of the law is also being challenged separately. Unpaid voter registration volunteers have to register with the Missouri Secretary of State if they think that they will register more than 10 voters. I did notice when I did this form that you have to fill it out at the beginning of every election cycle. So filling it out once isn't enough. You're going to have to do it like every 2 years and remember to keep it current. What I think is an even bigger problem, I mean, and that was, that was a lot of people won't know about it. It's not especially easy to do. But, what's a lot worse than that, I think, is the ban on soliciting absentee ballot applications, because that's a really broad thing that is not well understood. So what they're saying is nobody, whether you're a volunteer or get paid, can solicit another voter to vote absentee or provide them with an absentee ballot application. And when we discuss that at times at the MOVPC meeting, the topic of, well, what about, getting an absentee ballot for your college kid? And I had actually already done that because I had gone on the St. Louis County Election Board's website. It does offer that option. That's what I did. Then we had this discussion and I was like, holy cow, did I do something wrong? But right now, the interpretation of that is that the part of the law that permits people to request an absentee ballot on behalf of a relative is still fine. You can still do that. But again, the language is not completely clear on that. And that's another reason that it has been challenged. And this poses a lot of this can be really problematic, especially for folks who work with communities where people are disabled or shut-ins or older, who like to talk to those folks about voting absentee by mail and help them do the work of getting an application, because not everybody's going to be able to log onto a computer and do it online. That's really stopped some organizations and volunteers from doing that. And the people who ultimately suffer for that are the voters. And again, I hope that gets struck down, but absentee voting opens next week. So it's already been a problem for the most crucial period. So what's bad for everybody about HB 1878? And again, I apologize that my found dog, the found dog is whining and scratching at the door. But what's bad for everybody about HB 1878 is that, first of all, it allows for private audits of election results by companies like Cyber Ninjas, the people who went and did that sham audit in Arizona. That was bad because, you get some private auditing companies who do things that are not best practices. Suddenly your voting machines may be compromised, which I believe was the case in Arizona. That's extremely costly. So allowing those kind of private audits is disturbing, and even more disturbing against the backdrop of the context that we have in the challenges to the 2020 election. It eliminates the presidential preference primary in Missouri and establishes a caucus system. Lots of people don't like caucuses because it's so time restrictive. You can either be there or you can't. You don't have the ability to cast your vote over the same time period that you can with, absentee voting and election day voting. You just have to show up at the caucus. So some folks don't like that at all. It's also going to require Missourians to choose a political party when they register to vote. Historically in Missouri, you don't indicate what party you're affiliated with when you register to vote. And when you go to a primary, you can choose the ballot of any party you want at the time you vote in the primary, and no record of that is kept. Well, now people are going to have to register with a political party. And that is something that can be really intimidating for people who live in areas where their views are in the minority. There's a lot of social pressure attached to political labels these days. And, that can pose a situation for folks who are perhaps, afraid to register with the political party of their choice. The other thing that this does is 1878 allows the Secretary of State to audit voter rolls and remove voters. And as I understand it, he can do that not in compliance with the requirements of the Help America Vote Act. So that is a bit problematic and disturbing. Up to this point, the voter rolls have generally been managed by local election authorities, as most things with elections are. But this gives the Secretary of State a lot more power over the election, the voter rolls. One thing I didn't add on here was the fact that this law also grants the state legislature the power to control litigation. So, for example, if someone files a challenge to a law, a voting law, and the respondent, the Secretary of State, says, yeah, you're right. Once we got through trial, they end up dropping it because it's not worth pursuing. They realize that it's done and they're going to move on. Well, the state legislature can say, we're gonna take this wherever it has to go. So that's another example of how current voting laws are trending toward putting more power in the hands of state legislatures rather than in the hands of election authorities. And even though that's not the most egregious example, the even more egregious examples are where the new voting laws allow the state legislatures to essentially determine the outcome of elections. And, they're the ones in charge of the results, not state election officials. So a lot of states are struggling with that kind of thing right now, because if you look at the history of gerrymandering and voter suppression and how, state legislatures changed in 2010, how they've changed a little more now, you can have a state legislature that is not representative of the population of the state, and yet they're going to have ultimate say over, the outcome of elections in that state. So that could be really problematic. And I'm going to circle back now to the disinformation, misinformation, and manipulation issue, because this is so important. And honestly, since I started doing this particular presentation, my views on this have kind of evolved a bit, because I've been reading a book called The Chaos Machine. And we have a book club read along of that book that we've only had one session of. It would be really completely possible for folks to join in next Tuesday and just go with us from there. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the very end. So anyway, so we have this problem with disinformation, misinformation, and manipulation. And the question is what to do about it, because it has definitely gone from online to, it's gone from online to the real world in a very dramatic way. First of all, there has to be some accountability and regulation for social media platforms, their use of personal data, the way that they curate and push information on people rather than having people select the information that they see on those platforms. All of those things are stuff that we're going to have to grapple with from a regulatory perspective, or we're going to be in real trouble. I mean, we're already in real trouble. We will be in even greater trouble if that is not addressed, because many platforms consistently refuse to address these problems, even when they know that there are serious negative outcomes for real people. They're putting real people in danger. Real people have died from COVID because of misinformation that are on social media platforms. So and yet, even knowing all those things, I mean, heck, Facebook was even told by the United Nations that it had played a determining role in a genocide, and Facebook was like, so this is something that absolutely has to be dealt with. The other thing is actual accountability for bad actors. I know that we all remember the days, when career-ending political scandals would be pretty, I mean, by today's standards, almost like charmingly naive. Gary Hart and the monkey business, that kind of stuff. Now, people can actually participate in an insurrection against the United States government, and that doesn't hurt their career. I mean, You can have people out there making money, lying to people, and not just lying to people, but if you're somebody like Alex Jones or some of the other, conspiracy peddlers, you are not only lying to people, but you are, you're causing lots of folks to target certain groups of people for harm. So, Alex Jones did ultimately suffer some consequences for what he did to the Sandy Hook families, but that was only after more than a decade of those families suffering legitimate personal harm and fear and threats, and in the midst of like the most horrible grief you can imagine, he unleashed a bunch of crazy people on them, and it took years for that to stop and years for him to be held accountable for it. You have all the folks out there spreading lies about the 2020 election with no consequences whatsoever, even though what they did not only led to an insurrection, but it led to threats and the endangerment of election officials around the country, to the point where many election officials simply quit. And it's becoming harder to find poll workers. I think a lot of you folks will remember the two ladies from Georgia, the mother and daughter team of election workers, who were targeted by many of these folks, including the former president himself. And they were, run out of their house. They were subject to death threats. I mean, all on the basis of complete lies. And there really hasn't been any accountability for the people who ruined these ladies' lives, when all they were doing was doing their job, to serve their community. The other thing is changes to media coverage, because right now the media is really too subject to kind of buying into these narratives. They are so concerned about appearing objective that I think they've lost some objectivity and are treating things like a two sides argument when it's not a two sides argument. And they're very afraid to call lies. It's just and they also sometimes don't understand that the way you have to report on disinformation walks a very fine line, because repetition makes people believe things. So even if you are talking about disinformation in order to tell people why it's not true, just repeating it is, one more way in which folks are like, oh, well, I keep hearing that. So, I mean, it's just human nature. And so the media coverage needs to change in such a way that it focuses less on, concerns about engaging in what I think is artificial, both sidesism, and also, pay more attention to calling lies, pay more attention to truth, pay more attention to not amplifying insane claims. I think we all saw the reporting on the 2020 election and the aftermath, and all the absolutely, specious claims that were made about the election that the news, repeated as if, it was something that was worthy of discussion. So they also played a role there. And then the final thing is self-defense, and that's stuff that we can do. And I'm going to wrap up before I go into the whole thing, so we can just have a discussion about it. But my views on self-defense, which used to be, I had this whole thing like 7 things you can do with like your internet use and stuff to avoid being subject to disinformation. But the more that I read The Chaos Machine, which is a very thoroughly researched book about what has gone on inside Silicon Valley, what goes on inside the social media platforms, I'm not sure there is a safe way to use social media. Because even if you're being manipulated, there's no way you can know all the ways that social media is manipulating you and changing the way you think and selecting the information that you receive. That I'm just not sure that at this point there can be a completely healthy way to use it. I mean, I can be convinced to change my mind, but from what I am learning, it's not even the algorithms that are the problem, although those are a problem. It's the mere existence of a news feed that causes us to change the way we think. And the issue with that is, you know, it's so subtle sometimes that we don't even know it's happening. And you know, before we reach the point of no return, I think that's something that we're going to have to grapple with, you know, on an individual basis. So there are some questions out here. I'm going to see. So can you register as an independent? Yes. You can register, you know, you can do like no party affiliation. You'll have to change that if you want to, from what I can understand in the law, you'll have to change that if you want to vote in a party's primary. You know, you'll have to change your designation, and you can change it back afterward, but that's a lot of paperwork. I mean, to be quite honest, and that's and that's problematic. You say, I thought the party registration was optional. I don't know that. I mean, I think it's, you don't, again, you don't have to register with party affiliation, but you're going to have to do that in a different way to vote in the primary. So essentially, you're going to have to register with the party to vote in that party's primary, even if you change it back. So it's another question, you know, I get an absentee ballot request form for every election, fill it out and mail it in, and then get a ballot. Is that going to change? No. If you are on permanent absentee status, where the election board sends you an absentee ballot application for every election, that will not change, because that's just part of being in the, you know, in the permanent absentee program. So that won't change. But you can't, but then, you know, it appears that you can't go to folks who may need to be in that program and talk to them about it and encourage them and hand them an application to get into the, you know, into that program. You know, right now we're pretty much foreclosed from doing that. Karen Francis, what if someone has an order of protection and wants their location unknown? So there is a state program called Safe at Home that people can use to protect their address, and they can vote using a special process for Safe at Home. And I think that that's something that you would probably have to do through the state, you know, get into the state program. And then, you know, there's a method with the election authority where they can verify your identity through means that will not reveal your address publicly, because voter files are essentially public information.
Thanks, Jennifer.
No problem. Does anybody have any other questions? I'm not gonna stop screen sharing, because you know what? I'm gonna scroll through and try to get to the Chaos Machine read along, because I really, really would love it if some more folks would join that. I can see Karen is in that read along, and she will tell you that that book is just mind blowing. And we're going to be doing that every Tuesday at 6:30. We've only gone through the introduction and the first chapter. And so if you want to join, this would be a great time to do it. If you don't have time to join a read along, and don't maybe have time or the inclination to read this whole book, there is a podcast that where the author pretty much summarizes the book. And the podcast is it's John Favreau's Offline podcast. If you can find that wherever you read wherever you listen to your podcasts, it's about an hour long, maybe a little longer, but it really goes through everything in the book and in a very clear way, and is also striking on its own. A couple highlights from that I'll mention is that they did studies where people left social media for 1 month, and the folks who did that, who participated in that, ended up having improvements in their mental health, something like almost like a third as much as if they had actually gone to therapy. And they also found that their political polarization dropped through the floor. Like they lost that hyper intense feeling of you know, rage and just antipathy toward whatever the other side was for them. So I think those are a couple really important things. I personally gave up Facebook a while back and do not regret it at all. I know that for a lot of folks, their main concern is whether they can still engage in outreach if they don't use social media. And I think that is a conversation that everybody really needs to have, because one of the big parts of this is that our ability to engage in outreach on social media is so much more limited than we know now. If you are not paying for boosted posts or ads, you're probably not reaching that many people. And so when folks want to promote an event and kind of use the online method, the online event that they've traditionally used, you're probably not going to get as many folks as you did in the past, because people just aren't seeing those things online anymore. I mean, remember, the platforms determine what you see. So even if somebody has a big event that's really important, you may never see it come across your timeline. And so I think, evaluating the use of social media versus the name of the podcast. Yeah, well, I'm going to try to pull up I think I actually even have a link to it, and I will try to put that in there. Yes, it's through Crooked Media. So I'm going to copy and go hit everyone. And okay, it's not pasting, but trust me, I'll get it on there somehow. But it's Crooked Media, John Favreau. It is the podcast called Offline. And the title of the podcast is Social Media Can Inflame Your Emotions, and it's a byproduct of its design, although that's not, oh, and I'm sorry, no, it's not. It's crooked.com/podcast/ the inside story of how Silicon Valley rewired our brains, with dashes in between it. So that is a lot, and I don't know why I'm having so much trouble posting it here, but that is the name of the podcast. So I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can kind of have more of a conversation. Oh, thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate that. Michelle Steinberg has posted the podcast in there. And I do want to highlight, since Michelle has done that, some of the great work that Michelle has done on youth and internet use. So if you are interested in seeing the presentations that she's given about how internet use affects youth and manipulates youth in different ways than it does adults, including what it does to, girls' self-esteem and body image, and what it does to young men when they are being low-key recruited by white supremacists if they play Minecraft or other online games. I think somebody mentioned Animal Crossing even being a place where that process can start. We have posted a recording of her presentation at my website, which is nodisinfo.org. And there is a whole page devoted to Michelle's slides and the video of her presentation. And I really recommend that anyone with, kids, grandkids, anyone who is a kid, to give that a watch. Are there any other questions? I see a hand raised. I mean, I can't see everybody. So, I mean, and I don't know if somebody is going to be the arbiter of who gets called on, but if you have a question, please, I would love it if you would just speak up.
So I have a question. In addition to Missouri, because those races are important to us, what are the other states that we should be following? Which other state races do you think are going to make the biggest impact?
Well, and if you're particularly speaking of issues involving women and the intersection of that and states where voting laws have changed, or there are other reasons to be concerned about their elections, I mean, just off the top of my head, Georgia is probably the biggest. lots of things have changed in the 2 years since their last Senate election. So that is one that requires a lot of attention. And I think Arizona is another one where, as we remember from the whole Maricopa County cyber ninjas thing, that's a state where you could potentially expect some issues. And what's really, really unfortunate here is that, the 2020 election was run under such terrible circumstances. I mean, we all remember how awful 2020 was. And yet election officials around the country really rose to the occasion and did what they could to make elections work in a way that was safe for everyone and in a way that was reliable. And the election, went really well. I mean, that was a fair and accurate election, and especially under the circumstances. And the fact that it's being, questioned like this is really one of the most egregious examples of how disinformation can take hold. And then, but really to go back to the very beginning with the misinformation part, I think the fact that, when people don't realize how elections work, they don't realize that every state does it differently. They don't realize that people work in bipartisan teams. They don't know all the checks and balances that are going on in every state across the country. It becomes easier to question the process when it's so different from the one that you know. So, for example, we know that in Missouri, our absentee by mail ballots have to be in the election office by the close of election day. That's that. We get the absentee results on election night, we're done and that's it. But in other states, they accept mailed ballots as long as they're postmarked by election day. So those ballots could take days, maybe even a couple of weeks to come in. And that makes it easier for folks to question that process because they don't understand it. It's unfamiliar to them. And then you couple that with the information siloing that social media puts on you, where you are in even more of an echo chamber than you think you are. So it's like your world is very small on social media, much smaller than you think. You could end up thinking that the election result is going to go one way when that is like not even a remote reflection of outside reality. So I believe that some of the folks who question the outcome of the 2020 election, they sincerely believed that their candidate was going to win in a landslide because their entire information ecosystem, all the people they interacted with, that was the message that they received. So that's another way that it's easy for conspiracies to take root when you end up having a distorted perspective on reality. I mean, you see that in a lot of elections. I mean, I saw that in some primary elections in Missouri. The result was very surprising for people who were online versus not. So any other questions, comments, concerns? I think there are a couple hearings coming up, that Denise is doing on these election lawsuits. Hopefully we'll get some, at least the process well underway soon, but it's still going to be a real challenge to figure out how to educate voters appropriately for what they'll need for this election. I mean, does anybody have any questions about that? Like, I mean, I have a way that I've decided to put it, to word it in materials that I produce in such a fashion that it will be accurate no matter what happens. And that is by saying, if you have an ID, if you have one of the IDs shown at showittovote.com, which is one of the sites, Secretary of State's websites, if you have an ID shown at showittovote.com, then you can vote on a regular ballot. If you don't have a qualifying ID, you can vote on a provisional ballot that can be validated by a signature match. I mean, that would require the person to go online to find out what that list of IDs would be. But at least what you're putting out there is that, plan B. You know, if you don't have it, you're still going to get an opportunity to cast a provisional ballot at least. What I don't want is people just not to go vote at all because they don't think they have the appropriate ID. Oh, yes. Oh my gosh, Karen, thank you. And I can't even believe this. Yes, now is the time for me to plug election protection and 866 vote. I need volunteers. I know lots of people on here have volunteered in the past with election protection, and I want to assure you of a couple things. First of all, I am jettisoning all the technology that was problematic in August. So you don't need to worry about, you know, that Find My Shift or whatever it was. You can just sign up at protectthevote.net, and then you will receive from me a Google questionnaire that will ask you details about, you know, what volunteer role you want to play and what shifts you can work and, you know, where you want to go. And then I'm just going to make the shift assignments by hand. I really thought automatic shift assignments would be great, but be careful what you wish for. It was actually more of a headache than if I had sat there with, you know, a list of 500 people and just put them manually into my spreadsheet. So it's protectthevote.net. That .net is really important. And that will make you part of the 866 Vote election protection organization. 866 Vote is a hotline that you can call or text anytime. It's not always 100% live. Sometimes you will have to leave a message, but on election day, it will be 100% live. And folks can ask anything from where's my polling place to, you know, I have this really super complicated problem because I moved on the voter registration deadline or something. So, you know, there's a broad range of things that you can bring to the hotline's attention. Also, if there are concerns about how elections are being administered in, you know, your county, then you can call the hotline about that. You know, we did have, you know, someone in another county have a concern with something that their county clerk had said about how they were going to do certain things in August. That person called the 866 Vote hotline and the situation was resolved. So it's a really important resource to have. But please sign up. So, and I really want people to help in St. Louis City, because there have been so many changes to polling places, and that has been super confusing. I mean, the new wards don't go into effect until next year, I think, but they're being used to redraw the polling place, you know, the precincts and polling places already. Which means that in August, folks who, you know, maybe voted at one location for eons found themselves in a completely different location, you know, based on their new ward designation. And that was, you know, caused a lot of consternation and confusion. The city did take some measures to try to mitigate that. And the election information card they sent was really good. It really, you know, kind of told them what the deal was. But that's still going to be a problem in November. Turnout was low in August, so a lot of people didn't go through those particular issues. And there are some additional changes for November too in the city. Good changes, but additional changes. And that is that, you know, in the county, as we know, you can vote at any polling place because of their technology. So any polling place, doesn't matter, you can go vote there if you're a county voter. In the city, they had talked about getting that technology, but it hasn't been as fast to come in as they had hoped. So people still need to vote at their assigned polling places in the city, but they are opening a number of vote centers where any city resident can cast a ballot. And that's going to be really, really helpful, because if, you know, if we can direct people to those vote centers, then that saves them the trouble of like looking up their new polling place and trying to figure all that out. You can just say, I think there'll be, you know, 15 or so, maybe more. You can just direct them to one of those vote centers, and you know, then there's no question they'll be able to vote there.
Well, I am aware of the time. We have about 4 minutes left. I want to make sure, Cheryl Adelstein, if you have anything you want to add on behalf of the JCRC, and then I'm going to turn things over to Michelle Steinberg.
Susan, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Jennifer, as always, you were fabulous and provided so much information. I don't really have anything to add other than to ask folks to please consider becoming an election protection volunteer. I'm going to guess that in the next couple of weeks, we will be, JCRC and others on this call will host an election protection volunteer recruitment event. So you'll get to learn more about what's involved with that. So be on the lookout for that.
Thanks. Oh, and I do also, can I just give a plug that if any of you do go on like Nextdoor or something and see somebody looking for a young German Shepherd that was potentially recently saved, send them my way because we got their dog, you know.
Well, so Michelle, I'm going to turn things over to you to do the final thing.
Hello, well, thank you everyone who joined us today to learn about elections and voting, and thank our always good Samaritan, Jennifer Lohman, for your excellent presentation today. Our co-sponsors have been the Merowitz Center and the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, the National Council of Jewish Women, and I am Michelle Steinberg from Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. If we've energized you and you want to keep the momentum going, I hope you'll join us all at Dance the Vote on Saturday. This is coming up in 2 days. I'm going to put a link to it in the chat, which I could have done earlier. Here's a link in the chat, and it's free. It's at the Missouri History Museum. It's from 12:30 to 3, and there'll be dancing. You can watch or join in, your preference. There'll be musicians, singers, inspiring speakers, kids' activities. The largest ever photo of midterm voters and future voters. It'll be taken with a drone above the action. It'll just be all around a good time, and it's all about energizing voters, talking about the importance of voting, and it's on Saturday at the History Museum, and we hope you will all join us.
Jen Bernstein, is there anything else you want to add? Okay, well then I'm going to take the final minutes and just thank everyone for being here today. Thank you, Jennifer Lohman, for a wonderful presentation. And I have to say that if I were a lost dog, I would jump in your car too. So you've really energized us. We're ready for those midterm elections. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Oh, I see one quick hand. Oh, is that a thumbs up, Karen, or a hand? Thumbs up. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.